Hello, this is Gabriele de Seta. Welcome to this online book talk, which is organized by the ERC project Machine Vision in Everyday Life here at the University of Bergen, Norway. And in the next hour, we will hear from the authors of 3 books that came out in 2023, which all 3 discuss machine vision from different points of view. And the 3 books are James Dobson's The Birth of Computer Vision, which is a pioneering book tracing the genealogy of computational methods that have been developed in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, which prefigure the machine vision systems like face recognition or image analysis that we see everywhere around us today. The second book is Jussi Parikka's Operational Images, From the Visual to the Invisual, which expands the discussion of machine vision beyond the limits of human agency and of representation, taking the image and its operationalization as a starting point. And the third book is Jill Walker-Rettberg's Machine Vision, How Algorithms Are Changing the Way We See the World, which surveys a wide range of real-world and fictional examples to theorize how machine vision shifts the boundaries of seeing towards seeing more, seeing less, seeing everything, or seeing differently. So since all author names start with a J, we will proceed in alphabetic order by surname. So I would start by asking James Dobson to go first and give us a rundown of your book. And the floor is yours, James.
Great. I'm thrilled to be here today with Jill and Jussi to talk about machine vision. Thank you so much, Jill, for organizing this session, inviting me to participate. I'm going to share my screen now. I think that in all 3 of our books, we nicely managed, without much overlap, to address different aspects of a set of related and key humanistic problems connected with technologies of seeing and the automation of perception. I look forward to discussing some of these issues today. Let me begin by giving an account of how I came to write The Birth of Computer Vision. The origins of the book are to be found in the last chapter of my previous book, Critical Digital Humanities. That book was my attempt to articulate a set of strategies for critical theorists and scholars to traverse the stack of methods used in text-focused digital humanities. The last chapter took up a simple mid-20th century classification algorithm called K-nearest neighbors, or KNN. KNN is quite mature, but is still in wide use for a number of different problems. It extended the nearest neighbor rule, originally developed by 2 World War II-era statisticians, with the experience gained for military photo interpretation and targeted bombing of urban sites. KNN's authors implemented it with what I glossed then as a pseudo-democratic logic of virtual neighbor voting against virtual neighbor at the same time as actual neighborhoods were becoming increasingly segmented and fenced off, and were rapidly driving towards homogeneity. Linking these 2 moments, I argued that algorithm studies needed to be attentive to the historicity of algorithms and their multiple articulations over time. I turned to computer vision for a number of reasons. One was biographical. I had previously worked on 3- and 4-dimensional brain imaging data, while others were connected with my awareness that computer vision was increasingly being applied to many aspects of everyday life. In my search for an object that would motivate a larger project on the topic, I landed on the OpenCV package. The algorithms included in this open source package are textbook implementations and widely deployed in commercial and open source applications. They list here over 2,500 algorithms. There are numerous blog posts, introductions, books, etc., that make use of OpenCV. In my previously mentioned chapter on KNN, I critiqued a description of its operation provided by the OpenCV documentation for the way in which the project made explicit the digital redlining logic implicit in KNN's design. It turned out that a good number of the algorithms in OpenCV shared several genealogical features with KNN. There were numerous researcher scholars listed on the papers. that developed and perfected pattern matching, Huff line detection, and pictorial structures. These were also all developed to operationalize and solve military problems. Like KNN, they originated in an earlier moment, historic in the scope of digital computing, and have persisted into the present. The birth of computer vision puts into practice a type of historicism, of Foucauldian genealogy, that enabled me to trace the development of key computing vision technologies. It's algorithm studies done as history of ideas, insofar as algorithms are both material and immaterial. Let me concretize this. I name as one of the sites of the field's birth a machine produced at the Cornell Aeronautical Laboratory in Buffalo, New York. This machine was Frank Rosenblatt's perceptron. This device implemented early artificial neural networks for the analysis of visual information. It was called the photo perceptron by its inventor, and it's now gaining recognition as the origin of deep learning. Yet the perceptron was implemented as a software simulation of a machine on a general purpose computer before it was made material as hardware. The perceptron had a short life as a mechanical alternative to a digital computer. It was a simulation first. Interestingly enough, artificial neural networks remain to this day simulations of machines, hence machine learning, even if they're now regularly simulated on GPUs wired to conventional computers. In reading the perceptron, one has to understand the degree to which the imagined machine's architecture shaped the earlier simulated architecture. How might the software and hardware environment of the IBM 704 have also shaped these networks? In terms of computer vision, the early image acquisition hardware, a television camera, and the encoding schemes via what Rosenblatt called the retina influenced both versions of the perceptron. In short, there are different ways to cut up the assemblage of the perceptron. In the introduction, I write the following. Computer vision algorithms are frequently invisible. They may seem esoteric or too highly specialized to give them much serious thought, but these technologies are now utterly pervasive. They run the background, as it were, seeing and increasingly determining the world. These technologies are not just imposing order on the content of images. As prosthetic visual technologies, they're changing how we see. I think this decently establishes the stakes of my project. These are also key issues invoked by the other panelists. I think we also share an interest in the ontology of computer vision's image and the obscured theories, ideologies, and labor involved in the apparatus of sightless seeing. The birth of computer vision stays close to the algorithms. Perhaps out of concern the growing lack of specificity in the use of the term algorithm in cultural studies, or because of my interest in the technical aspects of these methods. But I tried to find ways of connecting these specific and historic algorithms to the reordering of everyday life, even in the present. Allow me to give a brief example. I want to reframe one of the key examples from my book through the what I now understand is the much better language invoked by Jill's machine vision. In describing thermal cameras invented for border control and military operations, she accounts for the different possible and even promising uses of these devices, such as locating and rescuing refugees. Yet, as she writes, the cameras retain the affordances that were encoded into them for a specific context. That idea, the retention of affordances from prior encodings, is key to unraveling the media archaeology of computing technology. These retentions may be perceived and felt in different ways, but they are there, make no mistake. Now let's turn to lane departure warning systems. These are the computer vision powered systems installed on most contemporary automobiles that detect the lines painted on the road and vibrate your steering wheel or push your vehicle back into its lane. The ideological reading of this scene writes itself. The active prayer has been replaced by the nudge as the new ideological state apparatus. Each time we get behind the wheel, we undergo a computer vision enhanced pedagogy and learn how to be good, docile subjects and stay in our lane. The Huff transform, the algorithm detecting these lines, comes from one of the most important computer vision and machine learning projects and from one of the most influential AI labs, the Shaky project at SRI International. This is the subject of the 4th chapter of my book. The Shaky project was a Vietnam-era robotics project funded by the United States Department of Defense. The RSRI researchers responded to the call for proposals for automatons capable of gathering, processing, and transmitting information in a hostile environment for reconnaissance applications. To develop a robot that could navigate through a room with movable objects required the production of a continuously updated map of its environment. These were then produced by the detection of lines from a continuous feed of images. The Huff transform mapped objects in space in the lab at SRI, but its real objective was to be deployed as part of military operations in the long history of imperial mapping projects. It's the argument in my book that lane departure warning systems not only have ideological effects in the present, but also retain the affordances of their origins, transforming our streets and neighborhoods as seen by our automobiles into hostile environments. By way of conclusion, I want to linger on OpenCV's advertised list of applications for this suite of algorithms. OpenCV's deployed uses span the range from stitching street view images together, detecting intrusions in surveillance video in Israel, monitoring mine equipment in China, helping robots navigate and pick up objects at Willow Garage, detection of swimming pool drowning accidents in Europe, running interactive art in Spain and New York, checking runways for debris in Turkey, inspecting labels on products in factories around the world, onto rapid face detection in Japan. Computer vision may have some beneficial uses, but its history and its present shows us that it's unambiguously entangled in nefarious projects, widely used to manage populations, convert our homes and streets into electronic battlefields, and to assist in genocide. I hope my book might play some small part in providing the tools for the critical analysis of these transformations and the others that are sure to come. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, James. They're fascinating insights, and I think they will lead quite nicely in the discussion of our second book, for which I will invite Jussi to join in.
Sure. Thanks. Thanks, Gabrielle. Thanks, everyone. Let me just share, let's see, some images. Let's see. All right. So yeah, thank you very much. Let's see. Let's see. I'm not going to be as structured as James was here just now. That was really a wonderful dive into a rich book. I'm so glad to be in dialogue with all of you. I'll give a really brief glimpse on about operational images. Now, as mentioned, operational images refers to a term coined by a filmmaker, artist Harold Farocki, roughly in the early 2000s. That refers to his video work that dealt with automation of vision and sensing technologies in military contexts, but also in other contexts of design, logistics, control systems that resonate strongly with what we just heard. So it's no wonder that this idea of operational images that is often defined by Farocki and others almost in a tautological fashion. Operational images are images that primarily operate, only secondarily they might represent something. It's a term that featured across the years in different ways, in different guises, in art theory, in recent takes on machine and computer vision, like today, AI imaging, in questions of transformations of the base of visual culture in context of data and networking, and multiple other examples as well. In that sense, it was a question that I also wanted to pose myself, that do we really need another book on the notion? But I also wanted to articulate a particular strand of thinking that is sort of a perhaps not at times only implied and not always explicated when using the notion. That is quite handy as it speaks across, like I want to claim in the book, not just in relation to digital automation of particular image operations, indeed, what both of these other books deal with so well, but also with a longer legacy of images and data before computers, before computer vision or machine vision, in context of early photography as well. Now, the book is stemming from a particular research context of a project that just finished, where I was leading a project on operational images and visual culture with 5 other wonderful researchers at FAMU in Prague. And it also resonates with some other work I've been doing that relates with colleagues in Aarhus with questions of the particular kinds of operational imaging that are central to modes of environmental management of different scales of whether it's not only climate change, but also other forms of environmental factors. So one of the things in this book as well is well, how to define this really briefly as well, is that I wanted to argue, and for good reasons, a lot of the literature on operational images has focused on war and military forms of imaging, and partly because of exactly this genealogy, for instance, since the Cold War, in relation to, again, of how much of the theoretical work was conceptualized at the back of 1980s and 1990s media theory of particular kinds, Baudrillard, Kittler, and so forth. But my interest was always to look at what operations other than war would be implied in operational images, how it relates to, and this is not any less conflictual histories, but also questions of colonial forms of operations of power, other forms of soft power in which operational images might be involved, like, for instance, remote sensing and environmental Earth observation, right? So I was interested in these kinds of expanded uses of the term. On the one hand, of course, and one could say that I tried to pitch the idea that this book would be a tiny bit more about operations than images. There's been a fair bit of discussion about what kinds of images they are, but I was also asking what kinds of operations are operational images. There would be multiple histories, and there's a couple of overlapping timelines in the book, but one, of course, would be operations research since roughly World War II, and then how it develops into particular management sciences in Cold War period, and has this sort of afterlife in particular forms of rationalization across not just images, but in institutional cultures, and indeed particular kinds of logics of governance that again overlap and might or might not come out as images in the traditional sense. Furthermore, over past years, there's been really interesting takes across the board on the operational or operative ontology or operative media or politics of operations, Metzadra and Nielsen's term, which puts this into context of analysis of contemporary forms of capitalism, which I argue exactly is a good example of the forms of data and visual culture where operations other than war, and often not less violent, are significantly about images or sensing. So Metzadra and Nielsen, they talk about notions of extractivism, of extraction, finance, and logistics, and some of those nicely overlap with what is implied in the body of operational images as a term as well. Now, I'm not going to go into, these are sort of like just a couple of things and nods towards themes in the book. A longer version, and I won't take much longer, a longer version of this talk that I've sort of developed is trying to narrate the book by way of leaving out almost everything besides the images. That doesn't mean that I would go silent, but I would, in this version, put the images of the book into image series or clusters and reshuffle a particular sort of a strands of themes or chapters of the book in such ways. What I'm going to do is run through just because of the key terms that are coming out, because they might also facilitate and imply some of the links between the books. So again, there would be a much more scripted version of this talk as well, where I would sort of do a reading across the images and introduce them as well. But I'll just sort of hint at what I find bundled inside this conceptual notion of operational images. And to add, one of the reasons why I was on a broader level interested, and I try to make the case, is that it's an interesting term exactly because of its nature, how it links different strands of humanities, inclusive of design and architecture, in the past 15 years or so. So media studies, art theory, art practice, various strands that are closer to digital humanities even, and multiple themes that seem to be straddling those lines and do not sort of fall into just one of these disciplines. And that's why operational images is an interesting bridging concept as well, and perhaps also acts as one for today's discussion. So for instance, and you can see the resonance with a lot of big themes of past years, logistics would be one where I introduce some recent art projects that are in the book, as well as the ways in which the role of images as part of logistical circuiting and governance becomes central. Of course, being a book about images, even if I just said that it's more about operations, I deal with light, but I also pitched a theoretical meta question, or pitch a question like that would go like this. A lot of operational images are often defined to be invisual or invisible because of the nature in machine to machine communication and whatnot. But I also want to ask the question of, if most of humanities, especially art history and other topics that deal with visual media, have been for pretty much since their birth, however you count it, some hundreds of years, focused on this very narrow spectrum of light that is visible light, what if the other really crucial task that we're now facing, that's been sort of a building up, is that humanities needs to focus on exactly the other spectrum of light, invisible lights, whether it's different forms of radiation, let's put it like this, than just visible, human visible light. Something that resonates with themes that Jill picks up on as well in the book. Hence, I talk about invisuality, hat tip to Anna Munster and Adrian Mackenzie for coining that term. And I draw from contemporary artworks like Rosa Menkman's project on impossible images, as I deal with these questions of what is invisual that is not just invisible, how it relates to questions of the long history of abstraction at the back of operations and techniques such as measuring or gridding as a particular kind of an unimage that is constantly in use in different forms of governance, military and non-military. And at the back of this is also an interesting scale of how scale and scaling functions in those. I leave you with this. Unimages is one term that I use that comes from photography discourse as well, but I can sort of speak to that a bit later because I don't want to take more time. I just want to hand it over to Jill. So that's a very crash course of some themes in the book. Thank you.
Thank you, Jussi. That was fantastic. And I'm sure there will be a lot of more discussion around these terms like visual and images. So I'm looking forward to that. And I will first ask Jill or her Rettberg to introduce her third book, or the third book of today.
Thanks, Gabrielle. And thank you for really great presentations, Jussi and Jed. It's wonderful actually seeing the visuals that would have gone with the book, because of course you can't include all those images in books, and it's lovely having that other modality. So my book comes out of as Gabrielle already mentioned, an ERC project we've run for we're coming to the end of it now. And we've done a lot of different work in this project, but this book is part of it. I think we're actually having a seminar today discussing what are our main findings. And I think one of the main findings is just that machine vision is more than technology. I came into the project, I think I'd read a lot about, embedded bias and how technologies, I mean, to be honest, I'm a bit of a techno-determinist. I think that when the technologies clearly do include things. Your example, Jed, of the thermal cameras developed for the military, transferred to a slightly different use, but they still are pulling with them some of the same biases, the same sort of assumptions. But there's also a lot more, and that's something that in this book I've been trying to look at. I think if you wanted to say what is machine vision today, to start with, I would have said, okay, it's technologies like facial recognition, AI-powered things, but I also see it more broadly because I like this historical view of it. I think it's technologies, machines and software that register visual data, that process it, that represent it in different ways. But I think you also have to see the context and the imaginaries. And I'm separating those because by imaginaries, one of the things that we've done in this project, but I think all of us have done in our books, is actually discuss artworks and how these technologies are used in art and stories. And I think these imaginaries that we have, whether in fiction, art, or just sort of, general ideas floating around, oh my gosh, technology is going to kill us, technology is going to save us. These imaginaries really affect the way that machine vision technology is implemented, is used, and there's this constant negotiation going on there. And by context, I mean, I was about to say reality, but that's not, well, it is reality. It could be anything from like the history of a locale. It could be the fact that this is being implemented somewhere where there's a lot of cars, or it's being implemented next to a fjord, or in a pandemic, or in a school, or in a society where there's a war, or a society where there's a lot of inequality, for instance. So the context is going to be different in each situation where machine vision is implemented. So I'm looking at ways to think through that and analyze that. When I started, I was attracted by images like this. This is from the Kinox, Ziga Vertov, Eliza Svitlova, and their collaborative, where they, in the early 20th century, the Soviet, where they made movies arguing that, the cinema camera sees the world completely differently from humans, and it needs to be liberated. This is just this fascinating idea, and I am very attracted to this idea that one of the things I think machine vision does that's really important is it allows us to recognize the limitations of human vision, right? We have two eyes here, we look straight ahead. There are so many things we don't see, but we want to see them, and we make these technologies so that we can see more, we can see outside visible light, for instance. And so we develop these operational images, and Jussi, you also go back very pre-digital to think about these images that do things. I think technical drawings like these are a way both of modeling the world, but also of kind of describing something that could be. Once Leonardo da Vinci drew these drawings, technical drawings were drawn from very ordinary things too, right? Like making how to make a barrel or something like that. But once you have the drawing, somebody who hasn't been taught by a person specifically, it used to be you had to be shown how to make a barrel or whatever. With technical drawing that's precise, you have the description. So things like this are, in a sense, a form of algorithm that make images operational this early. And that's one of the reasons I think looking at this historical perspective is really valuable. So machine vision makes it obvious that human sight's just one way of seeing the world. And that opens up this amazing potential. And it also leads, okay, the image on the left there is totally AI generated. I went a little bit over the top, but humans and spiders, for instance, see the world differently. I'm not even sure if the number of eyes on that spider is correct. It's probably hallucinated, but but a spider or a snake, like a snake, for instance, sees infrared, right? Humans can't see infrared. We can see straight ahead, where not as good our visual acuity, like we can't see details like eagles. We don't have lots of eyes all over our heads. And this brings me to biosemiotics, which, that was the previous slide. So biosemiotics was this approach, which I was sort of surprised I hadn't heard about previously. It's not much discussed in media studies. It's the idea that semiotics is, the human understanding of what does a sign mean? How do you interpret signs? Biosemiotics is the idea that every biological organism, be it a tree or a snake, has a specific way of interpreting signs in the world, connecting them with meaning, and actually making sense from it. Then Catherine Hales has built onto that, talking about cybersemiotics, which is the idea that also machines have this specific way of sensing signs in the world, processing them in some way, and creating meaning from them that I think is really rich. So one of the chapters in my book is about Alfred, our robot vacuum cleaner. Just thinking about how does Alfred sense the world? So this is what the producer explains, you know, you can program in these sort of no-go zones, it makes a map and so forth. Alfred has a collision sensor. So he notices if he bumps into something, he has an optical sensor, so basically just a camera that senses the same light that humans do, and also uses lasers, LiDAR, which bounces off walls, and he measures how long it takes for it to come back, and so that allows him to create this 3D space. So this is, in terms of cyber semiotics, he's thus interpreting a sign might, for instance, be he bumps into a wall or a sock or a cluster of cables or something. He interprets that sign, like that sensation of bumping, as like, oh, obstacle, stop, turn around, right? It then gets put into the little map that he's building, etc. He maybe sends a photo to us and so forth. Of course, I'm talking about Alfred as if he's alive, which, of course, Alfred is not alive. I'm zoomorphizing him totally. And this is something that relates to these imaginaries, I think, that we have. It's such a common thing to give your robot vacuum cleaner a name that when I went to look at the website for the model that Alfred is, it's got like a list of popular names. It's like, this is a pretty common thing to do. By calling him Alfred, it's kind of a butler name, right? So we're buying into this whole idea, oh, look, we got a servant. It's this very particular kind of socioeconomic thing that one could critique quite a lot. There's also a context. So that's sort of imaginaries. We're imagining Alfred as kind of, oh, actually, it's this bit I wanted. We're sort of imagining Alfred as like a little turtle or a dog or a pet, but also kind of as a butler. In terms of the context, you know, it's in a family home. It's not in a school or in the military. There's like, it costs some money. It requires power. So there are all these sort of physical and cultural aspects or contexts which determine how Alfred functions. What does Alfred do? What does the machine vision do in this case? Now, if you shift the context, this is the same technology, but used as a security camera instead, like a roving security camera. And Alfred doesn't have that. I can't remember Alfred's model, but anyway, our robot vacuum doesn't have that functionality, but some robot vacuums can also be used as little roving security cameras. It's the same technology, but it's a different context, which changes how that functions. And I think finding ways to analyze that is really useful. The last example I just want to talk to you about is from chapter 3 of my book. It's about surveillance in a neighborhood just outside Chicago, where we lived for a semester last year. And it was really interesting. I live in Norway usually. I'm married to an American, so I feel like I know America, but living in a place that isn't your home for a while it allows you to see different things. The context becomes much clearer, I think, or of course mysterious as well, but you're seeing it from outside and that allows you different insight. So we were living in Oak Park, which is this small, very liberal neighborhood, quite rich liberal neighborhood, just outside the city limits of Chicago. And while we were there was a big debate about installing some surveillance cameras. And those of you who live in North America might have heard of flock cameras. They have suddenly become very popular. They're like in lots and lots of cities around the US. What they are is they're license plate recognizing cameras. So they're little cheap surveillance cameras put around a neighborhood that can be installed by a neighborhood association or by the police. They allow you to search, so you can get a constant alert of when a car drives into the neighborhood that's not belonging to a resident or that is flagged because it's stolen or something like this. There's a lot of discussions about this. So Oak Park is this incredibly nice neighborhood. This is the house we stayed in, and you see the pink flamingos. We moved in just after Christmas, and this street is so nice and so friendly. They had pink flamingos as the sort of established Christmas decorations there. And there is a lot of social sort of cohesion in Oak Park. This is the main street. It's very sweet. There's, there's signs everywhere. There's also a big expressway with a lot of surveillance that divides the neighborhood between a richer part and a not quite so rich part. Here's the very nasty bridge you have to walk across to get between those two parts. And right now, I should have said that there was, like in a lot of the United States, there was really horrific racism in Oak Park in the, up to the, certainly, well, up to today, but especially like in the 1950s when people who moved, African Americans who moved in, they had their houses firebombed, a lot of tension. But there was also a very strong anti-racist movement there where they really worked to not have white flight. So it's a very particular cultural context and history in Oak Park, where I would say you've got the technologies, which, and it might work differently in Oak Park to in other American cities. Certainly it would be different if it was in Norway, quite apart from that technology would not be legal because of GDPR. So here you have the context. It's not just the context of the United States and racism and an expressway. It's also the context of we just had a pandemic. People are terrified. There's increasing fear. And we've got these imaginaries. In this case, I wasn't looking at artworks. I was actually looking at religious ideas and these sort of ideas about how technology can save us. The politicians just thinking that we have surveillance that will solve all our problems. On the other hand, there's this idea of technology as being racist, as being carceral, as being really more like a tyrant. And these are two very strong sort of stories that are simultaneously being told. So that is a few little bits from my book. And I really hope we can have some questions from the audience. I think there's so many interesting connections between our three approaches to machine vision, operational images, computer vision here. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jill, for this presentation. And I would like to thank all three of you for operationalizing your own time restraints. So we are actually even earlier than we thought. Before we delve into discussion, I would like to remind the audience, we have around 100 people, that they are very welcome to send in questions through the Q&A function or the chat or wherever they can write. And I will relay the questions as they come up to the authors. But I am sure that before that happens, all three of you will have questions or responses to each other. So I'll just open up to anyone who wants to start. You want to go first? Okay.
Sure. I was wondering, James, could you say a little bit more about, like, do you think that imaginaries and so forth are part of the birth of computer vision? Because you talk in a much more detail about the historical development and the technology than certainly than I do, and then Jussi as well, I think. Do you think that this idea of imaginaries and so forth is also relevant, or?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's there imaginaries are kind of explicitly invoked by some of the authors of these papers in things that are technical scholarly publications describing their inventions. We have myths, right, invoked of robots, of all seeing. I mean, some of the same myths that you invoke in your book, and those are ongoing. I showed an image from the Life magazine feature on Shaky, and that gives us the same sort of anxiety, right, that people have at present about AI and machine learning technologies. So yeah, absolutely. That was the entirety of the newspaper coverage of the perceptron, was like, oh, here's this scary machine that's a Frankenstein, right, that is going to do all of these, right? Frankenstein's monster, I think it was labeled Frankenstein, but yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think I had a tighter focus on the algorithms for maybe coherency of the project, but yes.
Shall I jump in?
Yes,
okay?
please.
Yeah, that's the imaginary question is really, really nice, and that's why I also like that you as you presented here as well. You plot these sort of possible routes, and in the book, of course, you also give more than just sort of a directions. You give also really nice answers around the kind of question of the imaginaries. Something about the notion of domestication, even in the midst of the otherwise military technocratic sort of like projects, and that sort of like that, which obviously is fun and funny because it leads to domestic AI as well. So there's this long legacy of these things that is interesting. In a very different book, in Insect Media, I tried to do a similar sort of a tongue-in-cheek imaginary of AI with not just artificial, but animal intelligence. And the idea of exactly these different sensorial regimes that are not just technological, but are featured in some of the literature that is parallel to whatever late industrialization or late 19th century, for instance. And it's interesting to track exactly these parallel discourses about forms of perception and seeing, for instance, in relation to animals as part of the broader cultural landscape of an imaginary as well, right? So there's the imaginary of technology, and then there's the for instance, the animal bit that is one version of this as well, as such. So this was also just to say that I really enjoy this strand in your book as well, Jill, when you draw in biosemiosis and its link to Hales and whatnot.
I will jump in because I think this will lead perfectly into the first question we got from the audience. This is Troy Asarte. Noticing that the robot vacuum in Jill's talk was gendered. They wonder if there is a connection between the male gaze and the machine gaze, and is there any particular feminist perspective on machine vision? So maybe Jill, you want to answer about Alfred?
Yes, there's definitely a lot of room for feminist critiques here. And there is a fair bit of feminist theory also in my book. I think actually one of the sort of feminist moves is perhaps this understanding things as situated, which of course it's not only a feminist move, but I do draw upon, Donna Haraway's idea of situated knowledges, the idea that you don't have like the one objective view of everything, which is rather common in machine vision technologies. They very often present things. It's like the dashboard that gives you, total situational awareness. There's other very specific ways, of course, that there's a male gaze. Like, I don't think it's included in my book because it's more recent, but for instance, cropping saliency algorithms where they crop, when you upload a picture to Twitter or whatever social media platform, and it crops it automatically, and they found that it crops pictures of men to show the face, but women will often be cropped like that, right? Which can be argued to be an example of the male gaze that's in the training data set. So AI is kind of normalizing, and I think that has a big impact both on whether we're talking about gender bias or racism or classist biases in many different ways.
And I think I will keep going with some questions from the audience, since this is also for Jill, but also could be open to others, by Shano, who asks, how could worldviews change, or how do they change based on machine vision and vice versa? So how does machine vision and worldviews influence one another? And for example, secular worldviews or religious ones, or would an imbalance of worldviews impact the development of machine vision? And also referring to how you see discussed military concerns. So I think the broader question is how do worldviews and technologies influence one another? And feel free to jump in if whoever wants to answer.
I mean, the thing I think is strongest is this, basically it's Donna Haraway in situated knowledges again, right? This idea that you've got the view from that gives you total control over everything, and this idea that machine vision can keep us safe, I think is really strong, and that impacts. It's how the technology is marketed. It's very heavy in the rhetoric there. But Jussi and Jed, you also talk about the military and these worldviews here.
Yeah, and I'm thinking, besides this photo view, but also like the centrality of then techniques, cultural techniques like filtering or augmenting, that come to play the role of what we used to call quote unquote ideology, that becomes infrastructured into the modes of perception and world making in those terms. And I'm thinking here Ben Bratton's point in some text some years ago on, I think it was on apps in general, but how religious fundamentalism would become the killer app in relation to particular forms of pretty grim gamification of the world in terms of, believers and non-believers, and you have it and whatnot as well. So you can see the sort of a lineage of exactly trying to think of in those terms that I find super interesting for sure.
James, I'm not sure if you had anything to add to the previous question or this one. Feel free to jump in at any point. Otherwise, yeah.
You keep going.
Okay. Yeah, there is a question by Sam Goree, who thanks everyone for the wonderful talks. And they ask if you all three think that these research findings from your books have implications for contemporary computer vision research. And they also wonder if any of you have tried communicating your findings to the broader computer vision research community, which I assume is the computer science, more technical side of things. And if so, how did it go? And I find this question very interesting because I grapple with it in my own research work. And I found that it's probably the hardest part to both get information from computer scientists and to share or discuss more theoretical or analytical things. So I'm curious about your experience with this.
Jed, do you want to go or?
Sure, I can jump in. I mean, I think one, both, positive and terrible thing about our moment is social media and our access to different communities, right, of researchers. And it's, it's clear there's like a small group of people working in computer vision and AI machine learning who are interested in paying attention to critiques. There are some of those critiques that are imminent within the field themselves, which I think is wonderful. I do point to some of the work that we cited in our books. That Joy Bulamwini's name came up, and our text as a computer vision researcher is deeply concerned about some of these issues. So I'd say, yeah, there's some ongoing mixing of interests. I think sometimes we're coming a bit after. I mean, this is the case with a lot of humanistic research coming after the projects have produced something or released data sets, right, and things of those kinds. So sometimes it's hard to close the loop in providing feedback on that. I did go to a computer vision workshop recently, and was kind of delighted to see in some ways that they're still using a lot of the methods like from the 50s through the 70s. And I talked with some folks about that, asking, have they thought about some of the implications, right, the assumptions of these tools. And yeah, we had an interesting conversation. So yeah, there's some.
I find it's I do try to go to computer science conferences and talk to AI developers, and I like it, and it's really interesting, and they do want to sort of hear from humanities scholars, but there's still a lot of trouble in sort of understanding each other's points of view. Like once I remember I was at one where there was someone doing research on fishes in Norwegian fjords. And there's a fjord apparently that has 3 types of fish, and they use image recognition to classify the fish to see which of the 3 kinds of fish it is. And so at one point I asked, well, what if a 4th type of fish comes into the fjord? And they just stared at me like, there are only 3 types of fish. It's like, there's no uncertainty in, and this is, of course, me coming from the humanities, so maybe my critique isn't even fair, but it seemed like the method itself, they were using convolutional neural networks, it doesn't do well with uncertainty, right? If you'd allowed it to have any uncertainty, it would just classify all the fish as, who knows, we don't know, right? So it's partly the method's not able to deal with it, but partly it's like the method of the discipline, like there are 3 types of fish. And it's difficult to communicate when your sort of research assumptions and methods are that different. I think that's something we really, really need to work on in the, like, just going forward, because it's so obvious that with image generation, generative AI especially, it's just so obvious that we're at this point where AI research and machine learning is really using the kinds of data that we in the humanities are good at analyzing, right? But they don't have that knowledge. And so we need to find ways of communicating better, I think. This is something I really want to work with going forward. Do you have the solutions, Jussi?
No, far from it. They wouldn't listen to me, for good reasons. That's absolutely fine. I'm not saying that in a kind of like bad way. What I found interesting is, besides the fact that, especially with you two, that the work in terms of computer vision, machine vision, that resonates strongly with that direction. But I've been sort of trying to seek, especially dialogues, in relation to, broadly speaking, environmental sciences as well. Just basically more to understand from their perspective of what is the image, what is the notion of simulation, in which ways is a particular form of understanding simulation in a screen at all visual. And those have been really interesting sort of like insights that people in ocean sciences, oceanography, have given, remote sensing of marine floors and some other fields as well. So it's that sort of a broader bundle as well of also remote sensing that I cannot claim that I understand, but it's interesting exactly to try to learn from that direction.
I mean, in part, we also have to do more work to actually, I mean, try to understand each other goes both ways, right? I do think that trying to sort of formulate, just daring to be, maybe sometimes put away some of the nuance and the critique, because in the humanities, we really are trained to criticize things, right? We're not really trained to build or to suggest. So I am trying to sort of think about how to, it's not that I want to stop being critical, but I want to also find ways of building more than we have been doing. Maybe there are some computer scientists in the audience. If so, please say so. How can we communicate better?
Thanks. I think I will bundle a couple of questions and a comments so that we manage to answer everyone who is kindly raising questions. So first, a comment by Geoffrey Winthrop Young, who says, more of a comment. Intriguingly, this is turning into a Von Hoek School webinar. When organisms are defined by being locked into a Umwelt defined by a set of signs that are meaningful to them. And we are applying this to machines, which raises the questions whether we were machines to begin with. And I think it's good to keep this in mind as I offer the next two questions, which are both related to epistemology. And one more broad by Karan Tripathi says, do you think machine vision is both shaped by and shape the epistemological and ontological politics of the context in which it is used? And the other question by Ashley Cordes wonders about knowledge systems, more specifically indigenous knowledge systems that have existed on a continuum before colonial times. Do you think that indigenous technologies and knowledges influenced computer vision, to which extent? And if any of you touches upon this in any of your books?
I only very briefly touch upon it because this is something I would love to know more about. Jason Lewis runs a project called Indigenous AI, I think, and I think you should look that up if this is a topic you're interested in, because there is increasing amount of work being done on it, and I think this is something we need, because machine learning is basically built on this Western epistemology where you classify things and use statistics and so forth. There are other ways of knowing in the world.
Happy to jump in on some of the epistemologies. Yeah, I mean they're all over computer vision, right? From really well-known issues with the labeling of training data and who's performing the labor, right? And what categories those laborers are provided with for labeling of of the training data. I think the algorithms themselves, I wrote an essay recently on convolutional neural networks having an ontology that collapses, maybe even against its wishes, if we could say that, subject-object divides, but at certain ways of framing what's in an image, ways of knowing what's in an image are embedded within some of these methods, right? Convolutional neural networks that are taking images apart, reconstructing them, applying that to the entire image space. Convolutions obviously mess with certain epistemologies and the larger ontology of the image. And then, yeah, the uncertainty that Jill brought up as well, where that's allowable and how that's expressed in images. I think a lot of this stuff is about reducing uncertainty. That seems to exist at certain times and places, right? Why is it we are interested in stabilizing with machine learning methods at particular moments in time, right? Are very important to pick up and critique, right? Why we have an interest in those methods that might be capable of clarifying things for people who want things clarified.
If Jussi has no direct answer to this, I will maybe, since we're rounding up our hour, I will just share one comment by Rafael Perez, who says that to have better communication between computer science and the humanities, it is necessary to develop interdisciplinary skills, which are often taken for granted. I think this is a great comment to keep in mind and think about for the next event or thinking on this. And I will raise a last question by Ranjot Taliwal. I think it would be good to wrap up with this, with your answer to this question. He thanks you all for the talks and books, and wondering if the three speakers could speak about what is gained and what is lost when we study socio-technical issues by using humanistic methods like close analysis of artworks versus, for example, studying machinic operations or histories or cultural practices, I assume, from a more social scientific perspective. So how and why did you go about selecting your objects of analysis?
Who goes first? Shall I? I'll briefly. There's a funny enough, Ranjot's question has a hint of what Jeff Winthrop Young was also saying as well, that perhaps in the first, but for instance, I'm interested in the question of exactly like questions of automation that do not replicate a linear history of from human to non-human, and that's automation then, but the ways in which particular mechanisms of automation were already operational in particular institutional situations, and hence replacing the question of operation into this level of cultural techniques of, for instance, institutional practice in which one was trained to draw in a particular way, one was trained to see in a particular way, which of course has all kinds of implications. Name your institution, whether it's a particular colonial institution or military institution, and that's basically it's training that becomes central in this as well. The training for particular mode of note-taking, notation, seeing, and so forth. So I think it's that, and that way we end up in this really, again, Hatsipu, Jeff Winthrop Young, and many others as well, sort of a recursive methodology as well, that you have these sort of ways of building up history into the picture without the sort of okay, here's the old technologies that got replaced by new technologies, but by these recursive bundles of cultural techniques that are really interesting to see in those slides. Hence, operational central term for me.
Any quick answer?
Sure. We were very systematic in the project overall. We developed the database with 500 works there were video games, digital artworks, stories like movies, novels, and so forth. And we developed the analysis model for trying to find how the machine vision in these works. I mean, these were all works where machine vision was central in some way. And we developed an analysis model so we could do the digital humanities and data analysis and data visualization of this. So that was a fairly sort of quantitative model at the same time as we were, and it was a combination, digital humanities. And that was really useful in terms of getting a really broad overview of a lot of different examples of things. Working with that allowed me then to choose examples that matched the sort of these gosh, how do you choose anything? I mean, it sort of happens. You write, things occur, things change. You plan the book, and it's completely different by the time you've finished it. You know, things get drawn together. Studying the surveillance in Chicago was, of course, because I was there and it was happening. But for my research personally, I really like combining the more quantitative, the more digital data analysis works with the interpretation, with the more ethnographic combining things. And for me, it's in those sort of the combination of those methods that I get the ideas, that I see how things fit, how they work together. What about you, Jed?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd quickly say that I think there's kind of a humanistic turn towards interpreting the output, at least, of some of these tools right now. I have a colleague in computer science who thinks close reading is like primed for a return in how everyone is looking at the output of prompts and crafting of prompts for generative AI. So I think that's really exciting. I think there's also been some really great work on looking at the image output, work on what Fabian Oefert and Peter Bell use technical meta pictures, right, from Tom Mitchell, to look at like the deep dream images and other strategies. So that gives me some like hope of good mixing of humanistic approaches, both in the visual space and textual space as well. So I think, yeah, there's some great strategies that we have that we also should be learning, humanists, to read and think about these tools, and from a philosophical perspective, of course, constantly, but at least my perspective, reinforce that these tools are interpretive instruments themselves and subject to critique as just as interpretive as we are.
Well, thank you very much, all three of you, James, Jussi, and Joe, for your generosity in sharing about your book and answering loads of questions. And I would also thank the audience. We had more than 100 people logged on and very active, so I think that was great. And I hope you all had a good time, and you will have a wonderful evening or afternoon or day, wherever you are. So thanks, and we'll see you next time.